this understanding further. For him, such activation is not merely psychological reflex, but a step in spiritual maturation. Archetypes do not arise to bind us, but to lead us forward. At an even deeper level, this structure mirrors what religious traditions describe as a calling. In the Bible, people often fail to immediately recognize the meaning of what repeatedly appears in their lives. Archetypal figures such as guides, challengers, or messengers frequently bring confusion, even resistance. Yet repetition itself is the sign that something essential is asking to be seen. In both Jungian psychology and biblical narrative, repetition is not punishment, but emphasis. It signals that the message has not yet been heard. When we pause long enough to listen instead of trying to banish the thought, a subtle transformation begins. We stop asking how to stop thinking about that person and begin asking what within us longs to be lived more fully. When the archetype is recognized and its energy integrated into conscious life, the role of the person shifts. They are no longer the center of obsession, but the bearer of a symbol that has completed its task. Notably, once the archetype is integrated, repetitive thoughts often quiet on their own. Not because we force ourselves to forget, but because the soul no longer needs to borrow that image to propel growth. This quiet is not emptiness, but the sign of a new level of understanding, one in which the individual stands more firmly within their inner world. Thus, the repeated appearance of someone in the mind should not be viewed as disorder or emotional dependency. From Carl Jung's perspective, it is a moment of spiritual significance, one in which an archetype is knocking, asking to be recognized and integrated. When we consciously open that door, the person no longer holds determining power. The center returns to where it belongs, the journey toward becoming a deeper, more whole, and more conscious human being. Archetypes do not arise during periods of stability. They emerge precisely when an old psychic structure is losing its validity. That is why the person carrying that archetypal energy is often associated with a distinct feeling, the sense that one cannot return to who they once were, not because the person changed you, but because they stood at the exact point where a chapter within you quietly closed. Number 4, they mark a phase transition in the inner life. Human life is a constant movement forward. Perhaps the psyche develops in a similar way, not through dramatic leaps, but through subtle inner shifts. Often we do not realize we have changed until we look back and notice that the way we feel, think, and respond to life is no longer the same. And sometimes, precisely during such an inner transition, a person appears, stays briefly, and witnesses you in a state that is no longer fully old, yet not fully new. When they leave, what remains is not simply longing for them, but a strange sense that a part of you has become attached to that moment. That may be why you keep thinking about them, not because they have not gone, but because they stood in the right place when your inner life began to shift phase. Carl Jung viewed such moments not through moral judgment or emotional sentiment, but through the lens of psychological development. For him, human life does not progress evenly. It moves through transitional cycles where the old loses effectiveness before the new takes form. During these phases, individuals often feel suspended, uncertain, and easily haunted by images linked to the transition. The person you cannot stop thinking about may be the living marker of the moment you stepped out of an old version of yourself, even if you could not yet name it. Jung described these periods as threshold moments, where the soul stands between two shores, no longer belonging to the past, but not yet grounded in the future. He wrote, "We cannot change anything unless we accept it." When you keep thinking about someone associated with a transitional phase, what you have not yet accepted is not that they left, but that you are no longer who you once were. The mind returns to their image as a way of holding on to a familiar marker, because change, even positive change, always carries a sense of loss. At this level, the person is no longer the object of thought, but the witness to your transformation. Before meeting them, you lived by familiar rhythms, believed familiar things, endured familiar limitations. After meeting them, even briefly, questions began to arise. What once fit no longer does. You realize you cannot return to unconscious living, and it is precisely this irreversibility that unsettles the mind. In modern love narratives, many mistake this phase for unfinished destiny. They believe that if someone changed them so deeply, that person must have a continuing role in their life. Jung would disagree. He suggested that some people do not come to stay, but to serve as thresholds. They are not destinations, but boundaries between two versions of the self. Thinking about them does not mean you have not let go of them. It means you have not yet fully met yourself after the change. A simple example. A man, following a career crisis, meets a woman during a short trip. They talk a few times, share honest reflections about life, then return to their separate paths. No relationship forms. Yet afterward, he finds himself thinking about her repeatedly. Not out of love or regret, but because after meeting her, he no longer views work, success, or himself in the same way. She did nothing to him, yet her presence coincided with the moment he began waking up from a life that no longer felt meaningful. Thinking of her is, in truth, thinking about the moment he changed direction and has not yet adjusted to it. At this stage, the soul does not rush you to understand. It allows the image to linger so you can remain with the change long enough to accept that a threshold has been crossed. When acceptance comes, something quiet happens. The image loses its sharpness. Not because you force forgetting, but because you no longer need it as a marker. Thinking about someone endlessly is not a sign of being stuck. It is a sign of silent growth. You are learning to live with a new version of yourself, to walk without old answers, to tolerate the feeling of not yet knowing who you are, without retreating into the familiar. That person was merely a light illuminating the moment of transition. Once you are accustomed to both the darkness and light of the new phase, the light is no longer needed. Looking back, we may realize that not everyone enters our life to remain. Some arrive precisely when a redirection is required, when an old self is quietly withdrawing, and when we step back to observe the entire process, their role becomes clearer. They were not the destination of emotion, but the carrier of a lesson that needed to be learned, not through instruction, but through lived experience. Number 5. They are a disguised teacher on the path of individuation. Every person living in this world is moving through different stages of development, whether consciously aware of it or not. There are periods when we are learning to expand, moments when we are forced to contract, phases in which the soul needs friction, and others in which it simply needs illumination. In each of these stages, life tends to bring forth the right people for the lesson that must be learned, placing us in situations that are precise enough so the process is not missed. For this reason, encountering someone, thinking about someone, or having an image repeat itself in the mind is rarely accidental. More often, it reflects a subtle orchestration within the inner process of growth. Jung believed that the soul does not mature through knowledge or willpower alone, but through meaningful experience. There are lessons that cannot be learned through advice, nor understood through pure reasoning, but only through being touched at a deep level. When someone continually occupies our thoughts, they are often activating a knot within the psyche, an old wound, a part of the shadow, or an archetype that has not yet been integrated. In this sense, they are not the source of disturbance, but the messenger who brings the lesson at precisely the right moment. Jung once wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." This insight reveals that inner growth does not arise from seeking pleasant experiences, but from facing what has long been avoided. And very often, the people we cannot stop thinking about are the very ones who lead us into contact with that darkness. They may bring pain, confusion, or deep questioning, forcing us to turn back toward ourselves. For this reason, they become disguised teachers, whether they intend to teach or not.